My name is Maren Whitlock. I'm 39 years old. And 6 weeks ago, I sat in a hospital parking lot in Linden, Ohio, with the engine off, holding a phone that had just told me the surgery I paid $45,000 for had never been scheduled. Not delayed, not canceled, never scheduled. There was no patient by that name. There never had been. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, with the window cracked open, and listened to the wind move through the parking lot like it was looking for something it had lost. I'm a forensic accountant. I have spent 17 years of my life reading bank statements other people thought were safe to hide. I have testified in federal court 3 times. I can look at a column of numbers and tell you, within about 90 seconds, where the lie is buried. And for 30 years, I missed the one buried in my own family. My Uncle Cliff is the funny one, the lovable one, the one who shows up to every funeral with a casserole and a story about the dead person that makes the widow laugh through tears. He's the kind of man who calls you kiddo until you're 45 and somehow doesn't make it feel patronizing. He raised me almost as much as my father did, in some ways. When my dad was in the hospital, Cliff drove 4 hours through an ice storm so I wouldn't have to sleep alone. So when he told me, last November, that he needed $45,000 for emergency back surgery his insurance wouldn't cover, surgery he was scared to even talk about, I wrote the check before I finished my coffee. And what I found out next, 6 months later, in a manila envelope on my kitchen table, they didn't expect. If you've ever loved someone who taught you, slowly and without you realizing it, to mistrust your own eyes, stay with me. This is the story of how I learned to read what was always in front of me. I'm Maren. Welcome to Hidden Family Revenge. Hit subscribe if you'd like to hear how this ends, because it doesn't end the way I thought it would. It ends better. You have to understand who Cliff was before this story makes sense. Because if I tell you he stole from me, without telling you he also saved me, I will have lied to you the same way I lied to myself for 30 years. When I was 9, my father had his first heart attack. He was 36. He was the kind of man who never sat down, and suddenly he couldn't stand up, and the hospital wouldn't let me in because I was too young. I sat in a waiting room with a vending machine and a TV showing a basketball game with the sound off, and I learned for the first time what it feels like to be the person no one is looking at while your whole life is happening on the other side of a door. Cliff drove 4 hours from Wheeling that night, through an ice storm bad enough that they closed Route 7. He showed up at the hospital at 1 in the morning with a stuffed otter he bought at a gas station because I told him once, the summer before, that otters held hands while they slept so they wouldn't drift apart in the water. He didn't say something sentimental. He just handed it to me and said, "Now you got something to hold." Then he sat on the floor of my bedroom that night so I wouldn't have to sleep alone. That otter is still on a shelf in my closet. Or it was, we'll come back to that. I tell you this because every story about my uncle has 2 columns, the one where he showed up, and the one where he took. And for 30 years, I kept the books in my head with only one of those columns visible at a time. I work for a firm called Hadley and Brent. We audit small estates, nonprofits, the occasional municipal account. My job mostly is to find what's missing. People assume an audit is about catching mistakes. It isn't. It's about reading the spaces between entries. A real lie doesn't show up as a wrong number. It shows up as an absence, a Tuesday with no deposit, a quarter with no invoice, an explanation that arrives too quickly. You learn to listen for the explanation that arrives too quickly. That's where the money went. My husband, Hollis, is a paramedic. We've been married 11 years. He has the kind of calm you only develop after you've held someone's hand while they died, and he has held a lot of hands. He's the one who tells me, when I work too late, the numbers will still be there tomorrow, Mayor. He doesn't push, he just leaves a plate in the oven. My father, Earl, died 18 months ago. Quietly, in the recliner he refused to replace. My mother, Norma, has been smaller ever since. She drifts through rooms. She forgets where she put things. She defends Cliff harder than she defends herself, and I have started to understand that she does this because Cliff is the only piece of her brother she has left, and her brother, my Uncle Cliff, looks more like their dead mother every year. 3 things I should tell you before we get to the part where I write the check. 1. When I was 26, I co-signed a truck loan for Cliff. He missed 4 payments before the lender called me. I paid them. I never told my father. I told myself it was a one-time thing. 2. When I was 31, I wired Cliff $3,000 for what he called a roof repair. 2 weeks later, I drove past his house and the roof had the same green algae streak it had always had. I told myself maybe he was waiting for spring. 3. The Thanksgiving before my father died, Cliff came over for dinner. He set his keys on the table next to the cranberry sauce. There was a small laminated card on his key ring. Gold border, blue letters. A casino player's club card from a place in Wheeling. I noticed it. I looked away. I told myself it was probably old. I tell you these things now because I want you to understand. I am not the smart niece who got fooled by a brilliant con man. I am a forensic accountant who saw 3 warning signs and chose every time not to read what was in front of me. 2 months before my father died, he left a voicemail on my phone. I still have it. He said, "Mayor, listen, whatever Cliff asks you for, don't lend him anything you can't afford to lose, kiddo. Promise me." I promised him. I meant it. And then, 6 months after we buried him, Cliff called me about the surgery. And I wrote the check before I finished my coffee. Saturday, April 4th, 1:45 in the afternoon. I remember because I'd just come back from the pharmacy with refills for my mother's blood pressure medication, and the receipt was still on the passenger seat of my car when my phone rang. It was Hollis. He was at work. He never calls from work unless something is wrong. He said, "Mayor, where are you?" I said, "Pulling into the driveway." He said, "I just dropped a patient at Linden General." While I was there, I asked the desk about your uncle, just curious, to see if his surgery had been rescheduled. "Mayor, they have no record of him, not last November, not since." I sat in my car with the keys in the ignition. The pharmacy bag was on the seat next to me. The smell was that strange, dry plastic smell pharmacies always have, and the receipt was already curling at the edges. I was wearing the gray cardigan my father bought me 3 Christmases ago, the one with the small hole on the cuff I keep meaning to mend. There was a sparrow on the fence by the mailbox. I remember watching it the whole time Hollis was talking. Because if I looked at the sparrow, I didn't have to look at anything else. I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I asked them to check twice. There's no patient by that name. There never was." I said, "Okay." I said, "Okay" again, and then I said, "I have to go." I hung up. I walked into my house. I put the pharmacy bag on the counter. I poured a glass of water. I didn't drink it. I stood at the sink, and I watched the surface of the water settle, and I thought, and this is the truest thing I can tell you about that moment, I thought, I knew. Somewhere underneath everything, for 6 months, I knew. You don't write a check for $45,000 without knowing. You write it anyway. But I drove to my mother's house that evening. She was in the kitchen, making the kind of dinner that doesn't really need making. Pasta from a box, sauce from a jar. The kind of cooking you do when you don't want to be in a room without your hands doing something. I sat at the table where my father used to sit. I had the bank statements folded in my jacket pocket. I had it printed out because I needed to see the number in ink, not on a screen. I said, "Mom, I need to ask you about Cliff." She didn't look up. She said, "Oh, honey, he's been having such a hard time." I said, "Mom, did Cliff have surgery in November?" She stirred the sauce. She said, "Well, he was going to. Then I think they changed the date. He told me they pushed it. He didn't want to worry you." I said, "Mom, there was no surgery. Linden General has no record of him." She set the spoon down. She turned the burner off. She did not turn around. She said, "Well, maybe it was a different hospital." I said, "Mom." She said, "Marin, your uncle is the only family I have left. And I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it that night. Because that sentence, Marin, your uncle is the only family I have left, meant, Marin, I am asking you to be less than your uncle so I can keep him. I am asking you to be quieter so he can stay louder. I am asking you, as I have asked you your whole life, to absorb what I cannot stand to confront." I did not say any of that. I said, "Mom, he took $45,000 from me." She turned, finally. Her face was the face of a woman who had already done the calculation I was just about to do, and had chosen, years ago, what side of it she was going to live on. She said, "I'm sure he meant to pay you back." I drove home that night, and Hollis was at the kitchen table waiting for me. He didn't ask. He just slid a plate of pasta toward me. I hadn't told him about my mother yet. I didn't need to. He had been a paramedic for 15 years. He could read a face like I could read a ledger. He said, "You okay?" I said, "I'm okay." He said, "Mayor." I said, "I'm not going to do anything stupid. I'm just going to look at the numbers." He nodded. He said, "That's the most dangerous thing I've ever heard you say." I went into the spare bedroom we use as my office. I closed the door. I pulled out my laptop. I opened my online banking. I pulled the withdrawal, November 18th. $45,000 wired to Clifford Mercer's checking account. Confirmation number ending in 4471. And then I did something I should have done 6 months ago. I scrolled back. I scrolled back and I scrolled back and I scrolled back. 3,000 in 2019, 1,200 in 2020, 800 in 2021, 6,000 in 2022, that one I had forgotten about, a transmission repair, 2,000 in 2023, medical copay. The numbers were not what bothered me. The pattern was what bothered me. Every withdrawal landed on a Friday afternoon or a Monday morning. Every single one. I have audited enough small businesses to know what a Friday afternoon, Monday morning withdrawal pattern looks like. It looks like someone driving to a casino. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a long time. Every part of me wanted to drive to Cliff's house that night and put the statements on his kitchen table and ask him to look me in the face. I didn't. I poured myself a glass of water, the same one for from Zaire, still sitting on counter, and I drank it slowly. And for the first time in months, restraint felt like power. Not the loud kind. The kind that arrives like a door, clicking open in a room you didn't know you were locked inside of. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. The first thing I did on Sunday morning was call my Aunt Ruth. Ruth is Cliff's older sister. She is 73 years old. She lives alone in a small brick house with a garden that takes more care than most people give their children. She has not spoken to Cliff in 9 years. When my father died, she came to the funeral, and she stood at the back of the church, and when Cliff tried to hug her in the parking lot, she stepped sideways and got into her car and drove home. I have asked my mother twice in my life what happened between Ruth and Cliff. Both times she said, "Oh, that's just Ruth being Ruth." I called Ruth from my back porch. The dew was still on the railing. I said, "Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She said, "Okay, that was it." "Okay, no, of course, honey. No anything for you." No softening, just okay. I had forgotten how much I liked that about her. I said, "Did Cliff ever borrow money from you?" There was a long silence. Then she said, "Marin, how much?" I said, 45,000 for a surgery that never happened. She said, "Come over." I drove the 40 minutes to her house with my hands at 10 and 2, like I was 16 again and taking my driving test. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already standing on the porch. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't sad. She was just waiting. She brought me into her kitchen. She poured coffee into a mug that had a chip on the rim. She sat across from me, and she folded her hands on the table the way my father used to fold his hands when he was about to tell me something he didn't want to say. She said, "What does the paper say?" I pulled the printout from my bag. I slid it across the table. She looked at it for maybe 40 seconds. She didn't react. Then she said, "Wait here." She got up. She walked down a hallway. I heard a drawer open in a back room. She came back with a brown accordion folder, the kind lawyers' offices used to use, and she set it on the table. She said, "In 1998, Cliff took $18,000 from our mother. He told her it was for a business, a printing shop. There was no shop. I tracked it down myself. The money went to a casino in Wheeling, West Virginia. Mom never knew. I paid it back into her account from my own savings the week before she died. I never told anyone." She said, "In 2004, Cliff took $22,000 from me. Same story. Different shop. I gave it to him, I knew. I gave it to him anyway, because he was my brother and I thought he might be sick. I thought maybe this time would be the time he stopped." She said, "In 2011, he came back for $30,000. I told him no. He told the rest of the family I was hoarding money. He stopped speaking to me. I have not had a conversation with my brother in 9 years. She slid the accordion folder toward me. She said, "Everything is in there, every loan, every excuse. Every dollar I traced. I kept it because I thought, someday, somebody in this family was going to want to see what I saw." She said, "I'm sorry it's you, honey." I sat in her kitchen for an hour and I read the folder. There were bank statements going back 22 years. There were photocopies of checks. There were notes in Ruth's handwriting, small, neat, like a librarian's, explaining what each one was for and where she believed the money actually went. There were ticket stubs. Cliff had told my grandmother in 1998 that he was driving to a printing convention in Cleveland. Ruth had found his Greyhound ticket. It went to Wheeling. By the time I closed the folder, my coffee was cold and my hands had stopped shaking. I felt very calm. I felt the kind of calm I feel at work 2 hours into an audit when the picture has finally come into focus and I know exactly what I am looking at. I said, "Aunt Ruth, why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Marin, would you have believed me?" I thought about it for a long time. I thought about my mother in the kitchen with the wooden spoon. I thought about the stuffed otter on my closet shelf. I thought about Cliff at Thanksgiving with the laminated card on his keyring. I said, "No, I wouldn't have." She nodded. She said, "That's why." I drove home with the accordion folder on the passenger seat. I did not call Cliff. I did not call my mother. I called Hollis. I said, "I'm going to need a few weeks. There's more than I thought." He said, "Take what you need, Mare. I'll be here." For the next 11 days I worked, not at my job. I took vacation time. I worked at our kitchen table, with the accordion folder on my left and my own bank records on my right, and Ruth's notes laid out in chronological order across the middle. I made a master spreadsheet, every dollar Cliff had ever taken from anyone in our family who had been willing to tell me. By the end of the 11 days, the total across 32 years, across at least 9 separate people, some of whom were now dead, was $147,000. $147,000 across 32 years from the people who loved him most. But here's the part I haven't told you yet. On the 7th day, while I was reconciling Ruth's records with mine, I noticed something. The dates of Cliff's largest withdrawals from family members lined up almost exactly with the dates of large cash deposits into a bank account in Wheeling that Ruth had partial records of from a private investigator she'd hired in 2011. That account was held jointly by Clifford Mercer and a woman named Janelle Pruitt. I had never heard the name Janelle Pruitt in my life. I called Ruth. I said, "Aunt Ruth, who is Janelle Pruitt?" She said, "Oh, honey, I'd hoped you wouldn't have to know about her." She said, "Janelle is Cliff's girlfriend. She has been for 26 years. She lives in a condo in Wheeling that he's been paying the mortgage on since 1999. She does not know Cliff is also married. Your Aunt Linda, Cliff's wife, does not know Janelle exists. Cliff has run this for 26 years without either of them finding out." I said, "Aunt Ruth, how is that even possible?" She said, "Marin, because nobody in this family asks him a direct question, including me." I sat in my kitchen and I looked at the spreadsheet and I understood something I hadn't understood before. The casino was not the addiction. The casino was the cover story. The actual machine running underneath 32 years of borrowed money was a parallel life, a second household. A whole human being he was hiding from us, and a whole human being he was hiding from her. The casino statements were real. The gambling was real. But the gambling was the small wound. The bigger wound was a $45,000 surgery that never happened, paid for by a niece who had loved him since she was 9, that had probably gone, in some quiet, untraceable way, to keep a condo in Wheeling out of foreclosure. That night, I sat on the floor of my closet. I pulled the stuffed otter down from the shelf. The fur was matted in places where I had held it as a kid. The tag was almost worn off. I sat there for a long time, and I held it the way I had held it the night my father was in the hospital. I thought about whether the kindness had been real. I decided that it had been, and that this was, somehow, the worst part. Because if the man who drove 4 hours through an ice storm to bring his niece a stuffed otter was the same man who took $45,000 from her for a surgery that never existed, then the problem wasn't that Cliff was a monster wearing a person's face. The problem was that Cliff was a person, a real one, who had done a real kindness, and had also, slowly, become someone who could not stop taking. I put the otter back on the shelf. Behind it, pushed against the wall, I felt something. A small wooden box I hadn't seen in years. I pulled it out. Inside, in my father's handwriting on a folded sheet of yellow legal paper, was an original loan agreement, dated 1989, between Earl Whitlock and Cliff Mercer for $4,000, signed by both of them, with the words, "In my father's handwriting," at the bottom, to be repaid before Cliff borrows from anyone else in this family, especially Marin. The agreement had never been paid back. Cliff had probably forgotten he'd signed it. My father, apparently, had not. I held the paper for a long time. I thought about a 9-year-old girl in a hospital waiting room, and the man on the floor of her bedroom that night, and the father who had signed a piece of paper in 1989, trying to protect a daughter who didn't exist yet. I want to stop here for a second, because I imagine if you've made it this far, you're sitting with a question. The question is, what would you have done? Would you have called the police? Would you have called Cliff and screamed, Would you have driven to Wheeling and knocked on Janelle Pruitt's door? Drop the word ready if you would have confronted him that night, or drop the word wait if you would have done what I did. Because what I did next changed everything. And it didn't involve a single raised voice. The day after I found the loan agreement, I drove back to Ruth's house. I brought the spreadsheet, I brought the folder, I brought the loan agreement. I sat at her kitchen table again and I said, Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it before you answer. She said, okay. I said, are you ready to be done? She looked at me for a long time. She said, honey, I have been ready since 1998. I said, then I think we have to do this together. Because if I do it alone, my mother will spend the rest of her life telling herself I was the cruel one. But if we do it together, you and me, she won't be able to make this into a story about me being too sensitive. Ruth said, what do you need from me? I said, I need you to host a dinner. I want to tell you about the 11 days between calling Ruth the night before the dinner. Because that's where the real story happened, not in the confrontation. In the silence before it. I went back to work. I sat in my office on the 4th floor of the Hadley and Brent building, and I audited a small estate in Toledo and a community theater nonprofit in Akron, and I did good work. And I came home every night, and I sat in front of the spreadsheet, and I did not call Cliff. He called me, though. He called me 4 times in those 11 days. The first call was on a Tuesday. He left a voicemail. He said, hey, kiddo, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a couple weeks. Your mom said you were busy with work. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. I had a little setback with the recovery. Doc says I might need a follow-up procedure. Nothing major. But I wanted to give you a heads up. Love you, kiddo. Call me back. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. I want to tell you something about a forensic accountant's ear. When you have spent 17 years listening to people explain where money went, you stop hearing the words and you start hearing the rhythm. Real explanations have hesitations in them. Real explanations stop and start. Real explanations leave gaps where the person is trying to remember. Cliff's voicemail did not have any of those things. It was smooth. It was rehearsed. He had practiced this on the drive over to wherever he was when he called me. And the most painful thing about hearing it that way was realizing he had probably practiced every one of them. Every voicemail he had left me for 30 years. I did not call him back. The second call was on Thursday. He said, kiddo, getting a little worried about you. Your mom says you've been quiet. You okay? Listen, that follow-up thing, I'm not going to ask you for anything. I promise. I just wanted you to know what was coming. Call me when you can. The third call was on Saturday. He said, Marin. Hey, look, I don't want to bother you, but your mom is starting to think something's wrong. You'd tell me something was, right? You're my favorite niece, kiddo. You know that. I have one niece. I am not anyone's favorite niece. I am his only niece. He has called me that favorite my entire life. I had never noticed until that Saturday afternoon that favorite was a meaningless word when there was only one of you. It was a compliment with no math behind it. Like calling someone the smartest person in an empty room. The fourth call was on Monday morning. He didn't leave a voicemail, he just hung up. That was the call that told me he knew. A guilty person doesn't hang up. A guilty person leaves a voicemail because the voicemail is the alibi. The voicemail is the record of trying. Cliff didn't leave one on Monday because Cliff, somewhere underneath his own performance, had finally felt the shift in me. He had felt the silence. He had felt that I wasn't on his side anymore. And he didn't know how to record into a phone what to do when the niece who had been writing the checks stopped picking up. I want to tell you about the night before the dinner, because that was my valley. It was 1:53 in the morning. Hollis was asleep. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with my laptop open, and the cursor was blinking in a text message to Cliff. I had written it. I had written, Cliff, I know about the casino. I know about Janelle. I know about the surgery. We can fix this between us. Pay back what you can. I'll keep this private. Just tell me the truth. I had my finger over the send button. I sat there for 11 minutes. I want you to know exactly how long that was. 11 minutes is enough time to talk yourself into and out of something 6 different times. Here is what I thought about in those 11 minutes. I thought about my mother. I thought about her face if Cliff went to jail. I thought about how she would tell the story at her funeral, 20 years from now. My daughter, who I love but who could not forgive. I thought about the casseroles people would bring. I thought about her sitting alone in her kitchen with no brother to call on Christmas morning. I thought about Cliff. I thought about the stuffed otter. I thought about the ice storm. I thought about him on the floor of my bedroom in 1995. I thought about the way he had held my hand at my father's funeral, and the way I had been grateful for that hand, and the way that hand had probably already taken $20,000 from a father's wallet over the years. I thought about Linda, his wife. I thought about Janelle, the woman in Wheeling. I thought about what would happen to both of them when this came undone, and I thought about how unfair it was that the cleanup would fall to the people who hadn't caused the mess. And then I thought about something I had not let myself think about until that moment. I thought about a forensic accountant named Maren Whitlock, who had testified in 3 federal cases, who had told juries with absolute certainty the numbers don't lie, the pattern is the truth, who had built a career on the principle that you do not negotiate with documented exploitation, and who was sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, thinking about offering to let her uncle pay back at his own pace, for the sake of her mother's feelings. And I realized, sitting there, that the most expensive thing my uncle had ever stolen from me was not the $45,000. It was 30 years of pretending I couldn't see what was in front of me. 30 years of making myself a smaller, dumber, kinder version of who I actually was, so that the people around me could stay comfortable. I deleted the text, I closed the laptop, I went into the spare bedroom where Hollis was asleep, and I lay down next to him, and for the first time in 7 months, I slept through the night. The next morning, I drove to my father's house. My mother was at her sister's. I knew the house was empty. I went into his old office, the room nobody had touched since he died. I sat in his chair. I pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were his old ledgers. He kept handwritten ledgers his whole life, the way his father had, the way I do now, even though everything is digital. I found the ledger from 1989. The year of the loan agreement. I opened it. I went to the entry for the $4,000 loan to Cliff. In the margin, in my father's small, careful handwriting, was a single sentence. Loaned C. 800. Won't see it again. Worth it this time. The 4,000 had been broken out, 800 at a time, over 5 months, each one with the same note. Worth it this time. And I understood, sitting in my father's chair, that my father had known, not for years, for decades. He had been making the same calculation I had been making. The calculation that says, the love is real, the kindness is real. This debt is the cost of keeping the person I love at the table. And he had paid that cost his whole life. He had also tried, in his own quiet way, to keep me from paying it. The voicemail he left me 6 weeks before he died. Don't lend Cliff anything you can't afford to lose, kiddo. He had been trying, in the last clear-headed months of his life, to do what his ledger had been trying to do since 1989. To put a railing on a staircase he knew his daughter was going to walk down anyway. I closed the ledger. I put it in my bag. I drove to Ruth's house. The dinner was Saturday night. Ruth had invited 4 people, me, my mother, Cliff, and Pastor Greaves, who had married Cliff and Linda in 1987 and who had baptized me, and who Ruth had asked to come because, in her words, if you're going to have a conversation that ends a marriage and a friendship, you want a witness who has seen the beginning of both. I am going to tell you exactly what happened at that dinner. But before I do, I want you to know that I had not seen Cliff in 73 days. I had not picked up a single one of his calls. My mother had been telling him I was overworked. She did not know about the spreadsheet. She did not know about Ruth. She did not know about Janelle. She thought she was coming to a dinner. We sat in Ruth's dining room. The table was set for 5. Ruth had cooked a pot roast, potatoes, the kind of meal you don't make on a Saturday unless you mean it. The lights were low. There was no music. There was a folder on the sideboard. Cliff did not see it. I had brought it. It was on the side closest to my chair. Cliff sat down across from me. He smiled the way he always smiled. He said, "Hey, kiddo, you been hiding from me?" I said, "No, Uncle Cliff, I've been working." He said, "Doing what?" I said, "An audit." He laughed. He turned to my mother. He said, "Norma, your daughter, I swear, the work she does. She'd find a missing nickel under a couch in Cleveland." My mother smiled. She had not noticed Ruth was not smiling. Pastor Greaves said grace. We ate. Cliff did most of the talking. He told a story about a coworker who had locked his keys in his truck 3 times in 1 week. He told a story about a customer at the hardware store who had tried to return a power drill from 1996. He filled the room the way he always filled rooms. He performed. Halfway through the meal, I set down my fork. I said, "Uncle Cliff, I need to ask you about your surgery." The room got very quiet. He said, "Oh, kiddo, you don't need to worry about that. I'm doing fine," the follow-up. I said, "Uncle Cliff, there was no surgery." He blinked. He looked at my mother. He said, "Norma, what is she?" I said, "Uncle Cliff, look at me, please." Not at her, at me. He looked at me, and in his eyes, for the first time in my life, I saw something that wasn't a performance. He looked, for a half second, like a man who had been caught at the end of a 32-year run, and who knew it. I said, "I went to Linden General. They have no record of you. They never have. There was no back surgery in November. There has never been a scheduled procedure with your name on it." I reached behind me. I picked up the folder. I set it on the table, between us. I said, "Inside this folder is every dollar you have taken from this family since 1998, from your mother, from Aunt Ruth, from my father, from me, including the 45,000. I have receipts. I have bank records. I have the casino statements from your joint account with Janelle Pruitt in Wheeling. I have the dates. I have the patterns." My mother said, "Marin, what are you doing?" I did not look at her. I looked at Cliff. I said, "Uncle Cliff, I have one question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Just this one time." He didn't say anything. I said, "How much of any of it was real?" Pastor Greaves looked down at the table. Ruth looked at her brother. My mother looked at me, with her mouth open, halfway between confusion and the kind of dawning horror that is actually recognition wearing a disguise. Cliff looked at his hands. He looked at the folder. He looked, finally, at Ruth, for the first time in 9 years, his sister, who he had not spoken to since 2011, who had been keeping records of every dollar he had ever taken for over 2 decades without telling a soul. He said very quietly, "Ruthie, you did this." Ruth said, "Cliff, I have been waiting for 32 years for one of us to do this." "I'm glad it was Marin." Cliff said, "I was going to pay it back." His voice was different. It was smaller. It was a voice I had never heard come out of him before. "I was going to pay all of it back. Every time, I really was. And here is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life. Because in that moment, I almost believed him. I almost felt sorry for him. I almost did the thing I have done my entire life, which is take a man's pain and make it bigger than my own." And then I saw his hand shake when he reached for his water glass, and I realized he wasn't lying to me. He was lying to himself. And he had been for so long that he no longer knew where the lie ended and he began. He had spent 32 years borrowing money from people who loved him, telling them and himself that he was going to pay it back and never paying it back and never quite believing he wasn't a man who paid people back. The casino was real. Janelle was real. The borrowed money was real. But somewhere in the middle of Clifford Mercer was a man who genuinely believed he was the good one, the kind one, the one who drove through ice storms. And he was, sometimes, he had been. That was the worst part. I said, "Uncle Cliff, I'm not asking you to pay it back. I know you can't. I'm not going to the police. I'm not telling Linda. I'm not telling Janelle. Those are decisions for Aunt Ruth and Pastor Greaves and you to make together in this room tonight, with my mother as a witness." I said, "But I am telling you this. You will never speak to me again. You will not call. You will not send a card. You will not show up at a funeral or a wedding. You will not be at any holiday I attend. You will not be in the same room as me for the rest of my life. Not because I hate you. Because the kindest thing I can do for both of us is stop being the niece who keeps paying the cost of a man who refuses to be honest with himself." I stood up. I picked up the folder. I left a copy on the table. I said, "Mom, I'll be in the car. Take whatever time you need." I walked out. I sat in my car in Aunt Ruth's driveway. The dome light was on for a minute, then off. I sat in the dark, and I looked at the porch light, and I waited for my mother. She came out 40 minutes later. She got into the passenger seat. She did not look at me. She said, "Marin, I didn't know about Janelle." I said, "I know." She said, "I knew about the gambling. He told me years ago. He told me he was getting help." I said, "I know." Mom, she said, "I am so sorry." I started the car. I drove her home in silence. When she got out, she stood in her driveway for a moment. She said, "Your father knew, didn't he?" I said, "Yes." She nodded. She closed the door. She walked into her house. I drove home. I did not cry. I felt the kind of clarity that doesn't arrive with a sound. It arrives like a door that's been stuck for years, finally clicking open. The fallout did not look the way I thought it would. Cliff did not call me. He kept the agreement. But he called other people. He called my mother every day for 2 weeks, asking her to talk to Marin. He called his wife, Linda. And Linda, who is a quiet woman with a quiet life, listened for 40 minutes and then said one of the bravest sentences I have ever heard secondhand. "Cliff, I have suspected something for 20 years. I just didn't want to know the shape of it. Now I do. Linda left him on a Tuesday. She moved in with her sister in Columbus. She filed for divorce within a month. She has not spoken to him since. Janelle Pruitt, the woman in Wheeling, found out 3 weeks later. Not from any of us. From a friend who was a cousin of Ruth's, who had heard the story at a Sunday lunch. Janelle, it turns out, had spent 26 years thinking Cliff was a widower whose work kept him in Ohio half the month. She had been planning, she told her own sister, to ask him to retire and move to the condo full-time once he turned 62. She had been waiting for him. I don't know exactly what she said to Cliff. I know that the condo went on the market the following week. My mother and I did not speak for 9 days. On the 10th day, she called me. She said, "Marin, I need to tell you something. I want you to let me say it without interrupting." I said, "Okay." She said, "I knew about the gambling in 2003. Cliff told me. He told me he was in a program. He told me he had stopped. I believed him because I needed to believe him. He's my baby brother. He's 8 years younger than me. I used to push him in a stroller before I could push myself." She said, "When he came to me about the surgery in November, I knew something was wrong. I knew the story didn't fit. I told myself it didn't matter because he was getting the money from you, not from me. I told myself that meant I wasn't responsible. Marin, I am so sorry. I let him take money from my own daughter. I knew, and I let it happen because I was a coward," she cried then, the kind of crying that doesn't sound like crying. The kind that sounds like a person trying to breathe through a screen door. I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something too. And I want you to let me say it without interrupting." She said, "Okay." I said, "I love you. I'm going to keep loving you. I'm going to come for dinner on Sunday. I am going to take you to your doctor's appointments. I am not going anywhere. But I am not going to be the person who absorbs what you cannot stand to confront. Not for Cliff, not for anyone else, not anymore." She said, "Okay, honey, okay." We did not talk about it again for a long time after that. Pastor Greaves, the witness Ruth had invited, called me a week after the dinner. He said something that stayed with me. He said, "Marin, I have been a pastor for 41 years. I have seen a lot of families come apart. And I have seen a lot of families pretend not to come apart, which is worse. What you did at that table was the most loving thing I have seen at a dinner in a very long time. I want you to know." I said, "Pastor, why is it loving?" He said, "Because you told the truth out loud. And in a family, the truth out loud is the only thing that builds the next thing." I thought about that for a long time. I still do. The money, I should tell you, I did not get back. I never expected to. The $45,000 is gone. The smaller amounts over the years, also gone. I will not be reimbursed. I will not see a settlement. I have made my peace with that. The number in the end was the smaller of the two losses. The bigger one was the 30 years. I cannot get those back either, but I can decide not to lose the next 30. Here is the thing I did not expect. Ruth set up a meeting with me 2 months after the dinner. She said she wanted to talk about something. I drove out to her house. She made coffee in the same chipped mug. She sat across from me at the same table. She said, "Marin, I am 73 years old. I have no children. I have a small house and a garden and a brother I no longer speak to. When I die, the family trust passes to my next of kin. By the rules of the trust, that is currently Cliff." She said, "I want to change that." I said, "Aunt Ruth." She said, "Wait, let me finish. I am not leaving it to you. I am leaving it to a foundation I want you to help me set up, a small one. It will give grants, modest ones, to forensic accountants who do pro bono work for families that suspect financial exploitation by a relative. It will be called the Earl Whitlock Foundation. After your father," I said, "Aunt Ruth." She said, "Your father loaned me money in 1998 to cover what Cliff took from our mother. He told me not to pay him back. He said, 'Ruthie, this is the cost of having a brother like Cliff. We're both paying it. Don't make me carry that alone.' I never told anyone. I want to tell you now. And I want his name on something good." I sat in her kitchen and I cried for the first time since the night in the parking lot. Ruth said, "Will you help me?" I said, "Yes, of course, yes," she said. "Then we have work to do. There was one more thing, the smallest thing. The one I keep thinking about." A month after the dinner, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was from Dale Kimler, Cliff's drinking friend, the man who had let slip 2 years before about Cliff's lucky weekend in Wheeling. A comment I had filed away in the part of my brain where I file the things I do not want to look at. The email was 4 sentences long. It said, "Marin, this is Dale. I knew about Cliff for a long time. I never said anything because I was a coward, and I liked him, and I didn't want to be the one. I'm sorry. I should have told you years ago. Dale." I read it 5 times. It did not fix anything. He had known. He had said nothing. There was no version of the past where his honesty would have changed what Cliff did. But the honesty arriving now, late, awkward, free of any request for forgiveness, mattered anyway. It mattered because it was the first piece of mail I had received about any of this that did not come with a please attached. I wrote him back. 2 sentences. Dale, thank you for telling me. I appreciate that you did. I did not say it was okay. Because it was not okay. But the email mattered. The acknowledgement mattered. The naming of the cowardice mattered. Sometimes the smallest sentence is the one that lets the wound finally close. Not with a scar that pretends nothing happened, but with the kind of scar that tells the truth about what did. It has been 10 months since the dinner at Ruth's house. Here is where things are now. The Earl Whitlock Foundation is registered as a 501(c)(3). I am on the board. So is Ruth. So is a forensic accountant from Cincinnati named Dolores who came out of retirement to help us. We have funded 3 pro bono audits so far, 2 for elderly women whose suspected adult children were taken from them. 1 for a man who was almost certain his business partner was draining his books to cover gambling debts. All 3 were right. The foundation does not get the money back. It just gives the family the documentation they need to stop bleeding. Linda, Cliff's ex-wife, moved back to Columbus permanently. She started painting again. She had not painted in 22 years. She sent me a small watercolor of a sparrow in the mail last month. There was no note. I think the sparrow was the note. My mother, Norma, comes to my house every Sunday. We do not talk about Cliff. We talk about her garden, which is finally surviving, and about my work, which she has started actually asking questions about, and about my father, who she has started talking about in the present tense again. She told me last week, Earl would have been proud of what you did, Marin. I cried in the kitchen. She held my hand. We did not say anything else. I have not spoken to Cliff in 10 months. I do not know where he lives. I do not know if he gambles still. I know he is alone because Linda is gone and Janelle is gone and my mother does not pick up his calls. I do not feel triumph about this. I do not feel relief. I feel the way you feel after you have set down something heavy you did not realize you had been carrying. Your arms still ache, but you can finally see what's in front of you. Hollis took me to dinner 2 weeks ago. He looked at me across the table and he said, Mare, you look different. I said, different how? He said, you look like you again. I want to tell you about the otter. A month ago, I went into the closet. I took the stuffed otter down from the shelf. I held it for a long time. I thought about the 9-year-old girl who had needed something to hold. I thought about the man who had brought it to her. I thought about the man he had been at the same time he was bringing it. I thought about how both things had been true. I did not throw the otter away. I put it in a small box and I drove to the children's hospital where my father had spent his last 6 weeks, and I gave it to the volunteer coordinator there. I said, this is for whichever kid needs something to hold tonight. The shelf in my closet is not empty. I put a framed photo of my father in the spot where the otter used to be. I want to tell you one more thing. The voicemail, the one my father left me 6 weeks before he died. Don't lend Cliff anything you can't afford to lose, kiddo. I played it for my mother 2 months ago on a Sunday afternoon. I held the phone between us. We listened to his voice together for the first time since the funeral. My mother said after he knew. I never asked him what he knew. I'm sorry I never asked. I said he knew, Mom. He just didn't want to be the one to make you face it. She said I should have been the one to face it. He shouldn't have had to carry that alone. I said he didn't carry it alone. He carried it with Ruth, and now he's carrying it with me. That's how it's supposed to work. You don't have to carry the whole thing yourself. You just have to stop pretending it doesn't exist. She nodded. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, Marin, I would like to meet your Aunt Ruth, I said. She'd like that, Mom. We drove out the next Saturday. Ruth made the same pot roast. My mother sat at the same table. They had not spoken in 31 years. They sat at that table for 4 hours. I do not know everything they said. I know my mother apologized. I know Ruth said, at some point, Norma, you were a child when our mother died. You were holding too much too young. I know my mother cried. I know Ruth held her hand. When we left, my mother said in the car I should have had a sister my whole life. And I had one. And I let him. She's here now. She's not going anywhere. I want to leave you with one thing, because I know some of you are sitting with a version of this story in your own life. The uncle, the brother, the mother, the father, the friend, the one who takes, the one who charms, the one you have been protecting from the consequences of their own life, because you have confused being needed with being loved. I used to think being a good daughter meant absorbing what nobody else could stand to confront. Now I know that being a good daughter means refusing, finally, to be the column in someone else's books that never gets reconciled. The most expensive thing my uncle ever stole from me was not the $45,000. It was 30 years of pretending I couldn't see what was in front of me. If you are the one in your family who always pays the cost of someone else's silence, if you are the one who keeps the peace by keeping yourself small, maybe it is time to set down the pen. Maybe it is time to stop balancing books that were never meant to balance. Maybe it is time to build your own table and sit at the head of it. I want to ask you one question, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Have you ever loaned money to family knowing, somewhere quiet inside you, that you would never see it again? And if so, did you lend it because you trusted them? Or because you couldn't stand what saying no would mean? Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely asking. Because I still wonder, some nights, whether I was lending the money to Cliff or whether I was lending it to the version of my family I wanted to keep. I'm Marin Whitlock. Thank you for staying with me. Take care of yourself. And take care of whoever is the column in your own books that hasn't been reconciled in a long time. Maybe it's you. Maybe it has been you for a while. I'll see you in the next one.